Shana Habaa Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. Over there in the...
Welcome to Theology in Perspective, the Bible teaching ministry of Dr. Daniel Woodhead.
Well, welcome back to Theology in Perspective. I'm Daniel Woodhead, and I'm blessed again that you could join us for our study of the book of Revelation, the revelation of Jesus Christ. When we left off in our last session, we had been discussing events in the middle of the tribulation. And one event in particular was going to trigger a massive amount of persecution of Jewish people. And that is the abomination of desolation set up by the false prophet who will be the leader of all the pagan religious groups that are not Christian, because the Christians will be gone, the church will be gone, if you will, before the tribulation. Now, this Antichrist, if you will, is seated in the temple, declaring himself to be God. The abomination of desolation in this newly rebuilt temple, because this is only 3.5 years into the tribulation, so sometime right after the beginning, which is marked by the Antichrist signing a covenant with some sort of a treaty, if you will, with the nation Israel, they get to rebuild their temple on the Temple Mount. And then they have this false sense of security for 3.5 years. Well, he goes into the temple. He has been resurrected. He's killed and he's resurrected, and the world just wonders, wow, this is happening. The false prophet, also known as Beast number 2, he sets up an image of the Antichrist like a puppet, and Satan causes this through this false prophet to come alive. And then we saw that the serious persecution of the Jews starts. And we went back through the biblical text, and we have seen how Satan has persecuted the Jews, constantly trying to stop them from bringing the Messiah and bringing God's word to this world. So, we looked at a whole series of persecutions that happened during the Bible, biblical times, and then after the Bible, and I'd gotten up to the point where the Nazis had persecuted them severely, starting in 1933, at AD, if you will, under Adolf Hitler, and it lasted until 45, and 1/3 of the Jewish world's population had been exterminated. And then I said, because of Zechariah's passage there, that 2/3 are going to die in the Great Tribulation. Well, when does this start? This is going to start with the Antichrist going in to the Holy of Holies and declaring himself to be God in the middle of the tribulation. And then he starts persecuting the Jews seriously, because 2/3 of them are going to die in the next 3.5 years. I want to take you back, though, to 1948, when the United Nations, as the result of worldwide sympathy for the Jews and being persecuted by Adolf Hitler, declared the nation on the eastern banks of the Mediterranean Sea that had been called Palestine, if you will, declared that the nation Israel. They got their land back. Now, the name Palestine, I have to go back a little bit. One of the persecutions was the Bar Kokhba rebellion, about AD 132 to 135. And the Roman Emperor Hadrian put that down. And he was so mad at the Jews for rebelling that he tried to call the land, he tried to change the name to that of their nemesis, the Philistines, and he mispronounced it. Palestine. And the name is stuck. But there isn't any region called Palestine, and there never has been. And that needs to be said now, because I'm going to go into detail about that soon. So, at the end of the Second World War, you got the British people in Israel leaving, and in May the 14th of 1949, Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, declares the creation of the modern state of Israel, and that's in accordance with this 1947 partition plan. President Harry Truman of the United States immediately recognizes the new nation, and it's followed hours later by the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. But the Arabs, they mount up an invasion. There was a group called the Arab League, and they were members, it was Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. They all declared war, and they rejected the UN partition plan. Now, Saudi Arabia and Yemen also sent forces to participate in the invasion, so it's obvious that not all the world felt sympathy towards the Jews. Matter of fact, some of the Arabs had even participated with Hitler in trying to exterminate them. So a new chapter is now being formed in this old, ancient persecution. And that is this new Arab persecution of the Jews. So, May the 14th, 1948, the modern state of Israel was reborn. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the members of the Provisional National Council, was led by David Ben-Gurion, met at the Tel Aviv Art Museum. And Ben-Gurion rose and he read this proclamation. This is interesting. He said that the land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people, and here their spiritual, religious, and national identity was formed. Here they achieved independence and created a culture of national and universal significance. Here they wrote and gave the Bible to the world. Now, what he didn't say was they gave the Messiah to the world, and that's where he died for our sins. So, he goes on and he says, exiled from Palestine, the Jewish people remained faithful to it in all countries of their dispersion, never ceasing to pray and hope for their return and the restoration of their national freedom. So he moves on or continues on to say, accordingly, we, the members of the National Council, representing the Jewish people in Palestine and the Zionist movement of the world, met together in solemn assembly today, the day of the termination of the British Mandate of Palestine, by virtue of the natural and historic right of the Jewish people and the resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations, hereby proclaim the establishment of the State of Israel in Palestine, to be called Israel. We trust in Almighty God. We set our hand to this declaration at this session of the Provisional State Council in the city of Tel Aviv on the Sabbath eve of the 5th of Iyar, 5708, the 14th day of May, 1948. So that's both the Hebrew calendar and the Western calendar. Now, at that time, the British were still governing Israel, and they refused to implement the partition plan. So the British government made it really plain that they were going to do all in its power to prevent the birth of the Jewish state. What's with this? The Abrahamic covenant declared, going way back to Genesis now, chapter 15, that the nations that blessed Israel would be blessed, and those that cursed Israel would be cursed. Now, that's from Genesis 12:3. But the Abrahamic covenant appears in several other chapters as well. So, almost immediately after this persecution by the Jews, Britain began to lose their great worldwide empire. You know, it used to be said that the sun never set on the British Empire. When immediately after the United Nations Assembly decision, the Palestine Arabs launched a preliminary onslaught on the Jewish community, and the British Army gave them cover and aid. Now, it obstructed Jewish defenses on the ground, and it blocked the movement of Jewish reinforcements and supply to outlying settlements. It opened the land frontiers for the entry of Arab soldiers from the neighboring states to come in, and it maintained a blockade in the Mediterranean, and it sealed the coast of ports through which alone the outnumbered Jews could expect reinforcements, so they didn't get any. It handed over arms dumps to the Arabs. Now, when Jaffa was on the point of falling to a Jewish counterattack, it sent in forces from Malta to bomb and shell the Jewish forces. You got to look at the Brits and say, what happened? They helped them for so many years, and now they're turned against them. But meanwhile, Great Britain continued to supply the Arab states, preparing to invade across the borders with all they asked for, and they didn't make any secret of it. In 1948, after the UN voted to give Israel statehood, 5 Arab armies, Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, which is now Jordan on the eastern banks of the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River, as well as Lebanon and Iraq, they immediately invaded Israel. And the stated purpose was to push the Jews into the sea. That is genocide. A man named Assam Pasha, who was Secretary General of the Arab League, he declared their intentions, and he said, this will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and the Crusades. What Hitler didn't finish 3 years earlier, the Arabs would finish once and for all. Now, there was a Nazi collaborator, and I had mentioned this concept in our last session, but this guy, Haj Amin al-Husseini, he led the Arabs of the former British Mandate of Palestine. He was charged at the Nuremberg trials in Germany, in Munich, before he escaped in 1946. Now, al-Husseini actively supported Hitler's aim to exterminate the Jews in the Second World War. Czechoslovakia was the only country that was willing to provide the Jews with any weapons because God wanted them to survive. He allowed them to capture territory from which the Arab aggressors had attacked. Now, Jordan captured they're referring to the West Bank, and their true Jewish names are really Judea and Samaria, or Yehudi and Shomron. But anyway, it included the Jewish eastern half of Jerusalem, and that became known as Arab East Jerusalem. Egypt captured, which was known then as the Gaza Strip, still there, going way, way, way back to the Philistine times along the southern coast of the Mediterranean there in Israel. Both countries murdered or expelled every Jew who was living there at the time. Now, during the 19 years that Jordan and Egypt occupied those territories, and they called them the occupied territories, neither country was willing to create independent states for the remaining Arabs. They began to call these Arabs Palestinians. And those that were residing in those territories, that was the Palestinians. Instead, those regions were plundered and allowed to rot. Jewish graves were desecrated. Gravestones were used to pave roads and build latrines. And the Jewish homes were given to Arabs. Most of these Jewish refugees went to Israel, and in a few years it doubled Israel's population. The Ashkenazi Jews who came from Europe of Israel, they absorbed the Arab-speaking brethren into society. A lot of the Arabs wanted to stay. Okay, they could let them stay. But by comparison, the displaced Arabs, the ones that didn't want to stay, were put into refugee camps by their Arab brethren. And most remained there throughout the 19 years that Arab occupied those areas. There wasn't any policy of expelling Arabs from Israel, but all the surrounding Arab nations expelled the Jews or killed them. So, nevertheless, there were disadvantages in numbers, organization, and weapons. The Jews still began to take the initiative in the weeks from April the 1st until the Declaration of Independence on May the 14th. There's a group of Jews called the Haganah, and they captured several small towns, including Tiberias and Haifa, and they temporarily opened up the road to Jerusalem. In 1949, though, because the Jews were led by some superior military men, and God wanted them to win, in 1949, they signed armistice agreements with Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Transjordan. Now, in April 1949, Transjordan changed its name to Jordan. Having lost in the battle what they could have had in the peace that was envisioned by the 1947 partition plan, Palestinian Arab terrorist groups called the Fedayeen, they just started these systematic raids against the Israeli civilian population. It was 1,300 Israelis killed and wounded by these terrorists between 1949 and 1956, and this group called the Fedayeen operated from bases located in and controlled by Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan. They sent these raiders in and then pulled them back. It was a constant threat. So I'm going to go through a few more of these issues, and you can see that this has been going on for a long time. Coupled with the persecutions that I've shown you in the Bible, you can see that Satan has been persecuting the Jews for a long time, and the greatest of them is yet to come, in the middle of the tribulation by the Antichrist. So let's move on and look at one called the Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis. In 1956, there was a war that was fought on Egyptian territory, and the conflict pitted Egypt against an alliance between France, the UK, which is Great Britain, and Israel. Now, the alliance between the two European nations and Israel was one of convenience, because the European nations had economic and trading interest in the Suez Canal. Israel had a pressing need to keep the canal open for their own shipping, and by the conclusion of the war, only Israel enjoyed any benefits or any gains out of this. But the root of the crisis went all the way back to 1952, when officers in the Egyptian army overthrew a licentious monarch under a guy named King Farouk. They abandoned policies that were put in place to cooperate with these European powers, and the new government in Egypt wanted to undertake a more nationalistic and, let's say, assertive stance. Now, this led to the conflict with Israel and the European powers over the Suez Canal. All shipping in that region came through that canal. That was a very important canal. Well, it still is a very important canal. Throughout 1956, there was a conflict, and it increased between Israel and Egypt, with Israel launching frequent incursions into the Egyptian territory, and Egypt increasingly defending itself. Egypt, under the leadership of one Gamal Abdul Nasser, he blockaded the Gulf of Aqaba and closed the Suez Canal to any Israeli shipping. At the same time, Egypt nationalized the canal. This is a vital route to the east that the Brits, and especially the British banks, they had a 44% ownership stake in this. So the British Prime Minister at the time was a guy named Anthony Eden. He needed to persuade the British public to go to war, and he compared Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal with the nationalism 20 years earlier of Mussolini and Hitler. So on October 29th, Israel invaded the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula, and they made rapid progress towards the Canal Zone. And then this agreement came up where Britain and France offered to reoccupy the area and separate these warring factions. And it was greeted by wonderful affirming by the Egyptian crowds. They, however, refused the offer. And that gave the European powers a pretext for a joint invasion to regain control of the canal and topple the Nasser regime. So the campaign progressed as it was planned at first, but the European forces never reached the canal itself. Israel captured the Gaza Strip, as I've mentioned in the course of the war, and the whole episode is usually regarded to Britain as an embarrassment. Eden was forced to resign because, well, one, ill health, and he had a lot of opposition in his Labour Party over this invasion of Egypt. It just didn't work out for them. The invading forces were forced to withdraw in March of 57 under pressure from the United States, and they saw good relations with the Third World as being more important than defending Anglo-French interest. Now, what was really significant is that the U.S. feared that it was going to be a wider war because the USSR at the time, that was the old Soviet Union, offered to intervene on the Russian side. After the withdrawal, the United Nations established the UN Emergency Force, and it was designed to keep peace in the area, and there was a few thousand casualties. Most of them were Egyptian and civilian. And in a way, it marked the end of the British Empire, like it says in the Abrahamic Covenant. I'm going to bless those that bless you and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Crisis also marked the transfer of power to the new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. That still exists today. The Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc of power, if you will, is still feeding the Arabs. The United States and the Western democracies are feeding Israel in this long-standing fight. Now, we're going back now into the 50s. Nasser is the president of Egypt, and this improved his standing in the Arab world because it hastened this process of decolonization of the rest of the remaining colonies of France and Britain. Now, the next war was the 67 Six-Day War. Nasser, again, he orders a blockade of the Straits of Tiran, and that cut off Israel's southern access to the Red Sea and beyond. So, May the 31st, Egypt moves 100,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, and 500 heavy guns into the Sinai. By June the 4th, Israel was outnumbered by Arab forces, 3-1 on its border. And that was Israel's Six-Day War, was fought on 3 fronts against 3 companies and 3 overlapping stages. And in the south, Israel engaged and defeated the Egyptians. In the central region, Israel engaged and defeated the Jordanians. In the north, Israel engaged and defeated the Syrians. In each one of these theaters, Israel gained significant territory and was going to serve as its own buffers in future years. So on the morning of June the 5th, the Israeli Air Force destroyed almost the entire Egyptian Air Force, and that was more than 300 planes in 3 hours. Israel's armored divisions under General Ariel Sharon launched a lightning attack on the same day, and more than 800 Egyptian tanks were destroyed, and thousands of soldiers were taken as prisoners of war. Nasser, the Egyptian president, finally acknowledged that 80% of the Egyptian Russian-supplied military equipment had been lost in the Sinai debacle. And at 8 o'clock on June the 8th, Nasser accepted a ceasefire. But interestingly, from 1948 until 1967, Jerusalem was a divided city. East Jerusalem, including the Old City, been occupied by the Arab Legion of Jordan since 1948, the War of Independence. The Jordanian troops had decimated the Jewish quarter of the Old City, blowing up its synagogues, destroying every vestige of Jewish life there that they could. And during the initial battle with Egypt, Israel actually notified King Hussein of Jordan They had no intention of attacking his country. Hussein, however, believed the lies coming out of Egypt from Nasser, and he joins in with the Arabs. When the Arab League began to shell western Jerusalem, the Israelis quickly counterattacked, and they were successful. Listen to this. Paratroopers landed and attacked from the Mount of Olives, and they entered into the Lion Gate on the east, and Israel was careful to just minimize any use of any artillery because they didn't want to harm the city, the old city. But that would have made the attack much easier with less loss of life. But they did this because there's so many holy cities there, or so many holy sites and inside these ancient walls. On June the 8th, the Israeli troops were looking at Herod's stones of the Western Wall. And Jerusalem was the central prize, and Israel captured, in those 4 days, the ancient areas of biblical Judea and Samaria. Now, the critics call this the West Bank, and that seems to be what sticks. But this is not the West Bank. This is Judea and Samaria. These are not only the sites of biblical Jerusalem, but these are the ancient towns of Shechem and Shiloh and Bethel and Bethlehem and Hebron. Egypt had an ally in the north. That was Syria. From their heavily fortified bunkers and trenches along the Golan Heights, they had harassed Jewish farmers and fishermen of the Hule Valley and the Sea of Galilee for about 19 years. And the problem for the Israelis was that the Syrians literally held the high ground, and they had sponsors from Russia that had helped them fortify it. Now, Syria was also threatening Israelis' destruction, and they had these Russian armaments, and there was an opportunity here to end the threat for its northern citizens once and for all. So there was a battle for the Golan, and it was different. It wasn't desert like the Sinai where the tanks could easily maneuver here. So the Syrians had planted millions of mines to stop any Israeli response to its constant shelling. The Air Force prepared the way by landing paratroopers behind the Syrian lines in the north, the other side of the Golan, and one unit of paratroopers actually fought on all 3 fronts of the war in those 6 days. The 6 days. Finally, Israeli bulldozers went in. They cleared the way so the armored units could batter the Syrian troops and drive them deep into the Golan. Syria accepted a ceasefire on June the 10th. That was an amazing military victory. Look what God has given them, one after another after another. The 6-day war left about 700 Israelis dead, about 2,500 wounded, and although there was never really any official figures released about the Arab casualties, they were estimated very conservatively about 15,000. The prime minister at the time of Israel was Golda Meir, and she expressed feelings of the Israelis well when she remarked, we can forgive the Arabs for killing our sons. We can't forgive them for forcing us to kill their sons. She also made the statement that the wars will finally end when the Arabs and the Muslims love their own children more than they hate the Jews. So, the 6-day war established Israel as a major military power, but it unexpectedly cast them in this role of occupier, because the war now was one of this Fedayim-type attrition, and it was going to be fought in the media over the next number of years. Now, I'm going to close there for right now, and we're going to pick this up in our next session when we talk about, in 1973, after another war, the Yom Kippor War, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt finally acknowledges the legitimate existence of Israel. Well, God bless you, and I look forward to being with you in our next session.
We hope you have been blessed by this message today on a contemporarily relevant Bible topic. Dr. Woodhead has been teaching the Bible for 25 years. He is a pastor, an author, and conference speaker on various biblical subjects. Dr. Woodhead is the Dean of the Jewish Studies School at Schofield Seminary. His seminary teaching includes the Old Testament and Biblical Hebrew. He has attended Hebrew University in Jerusalem and Hebrew College in Massachusetts. If you would like a DVD of today's program, please write us at Post Office Box 48, Hart, Michigan, 49420. Again, that's Post Office Box 48, Hart, Michigan, 49420, or call us at 877-706-2479. That's 877-706-2479. Once again, 877-706-2479. The cost is $15. Let us know if you have any questions about today's broadcast. We look forward to providing you with continuing Bible messages each week on this station. God bless you.
Take us there to the land of Zion, next year in Jerusalem. L'shana haba'ah beYerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. O hear, O Israel, hear. O Lord, thy kingdom come, thy will be done next year. L'shana haba'ah beYerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem.